on the morning of February 14, 1879, in a small farming hamlet in Schoharie County, New York. Three neighbors forced open the frozen door of a single-story clapboard house. There they found something that three different physicians, two county coroners, and one Albany professor of medicine would spend the rest of their lives refusing to explain. A woman of 26 had been reduced from the shoulders down to a fine gray ash that held the exact shape of her body against the floorboards. Her head, left forearm, and one stockinged foot remained completely untouched. The chair she had been sitting in was barely scorched. The wooden floor beneath her bore a dark oval stain no larger than a serving platter. Not a single curtain, book, or the oil lamp 3 feet from her elbow had caught fire. Her name was Ruth Payne. What happened to her inside that locked house during the coldest night of that winter was reported in 4 county newspapers, debated in at least 11 medical journals, and then, within 18 months, deliberately erased from every official record the county possessed. Before we continue with Ruth Payne's story and the house on Cobble Hill Road, if you are hearing this, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us which state or city you're listening from tonight. We want to know where our listeners are, because what you're about to hear was almost buried forever. The people who tried to bury it had more reasons than you can imagine and more power than you'd like to believe a handful of ordinary men could ever have possessed. To understand what happened to Ruth Payne, you first have to understand the place she lived in. The place itself is a kind of character in this story. Without it, nothing that followed would make any sense at all. Schoharie County, in the late 1870s, was a patchwork of Dutch stone houses and Yankee clapboard farms tucked into the folded hills west of Albany. A country of long valleys and short tempers. German Palatine families, who had arrived 150 years earlier, still spoke a rough, low dialect at home, and English only in church and at the market. The land was old for America, settled before the Revolution, cleared of its oak and hickory by the grandfathers of the men farming it now. In many places, the stone walls marking the edges of pastures were already sinking back into the earth. The county seat was a sleepy town of shops, a courthouse and a dairy exchange. But the hamlet where Ruth lived, a cluster of 7 houses and a Methodist chapel known locally as Cobble Hollow, was not on most maps. It sat at the end of a wagon road that became impassable between December and March. In winter, the only way out was a sled track cutting north across the frozen brook toward the mill at Break-a-Bean. Cobble Hollow was the kind of place where a family could vanish into the snow, and nobody in the county offices would notice for a month, and where the people who lived there had long ago learned to prefer it that way. The winter of 1878-79 was, by every account kept at the time, the worst in 40 years. The thermometer at the Break-a-Bean post office recorded 28 degrees below zero on the night Ruth Payne died. Snow had been falling off and on since the first week of November. Drifts against the north side of the chapel stood taller than a man. The roof of the Kieserlich farm had collapsed under their weight in early January. Children weren't sent to the one-room school for weeks at a time. Old men died in their sleep and were stored, wrapped in canvas, in cold parlors until the ground thawed enough to bury them. It was a winter that she music pressed down on the hamlet like the palm of a great hand. The people who lived through it would speak of it decades later, as if it had been a single long night from which no one fully woke. Ruth had come to Cobble Hollow 3 years earlier as a young bride. She was born Ruth Vosberg in the Mohawk Valley, the daughter of a Dutch Reformed minister who had died of consumption when she was 19. She had taught school in Amsterdam, New York, for 2 winters before meeting Daniel Payne at a Grange Hall dance in the autumn of 1875. Her father had been a stern man, a preacher of the old predestinarian school. He had taught Ruth to read Latin and Greek before she was 12. Her mother had died when Ruth was 5, leaving behind a single daguerreotype of a dark-haired, music young woman in a lace collar, and a small collection of poetry books that Ruth carried with her, tied in a bundle with a ribbon, everywhere she went for the rest of her life. Daniel Payne was 9 years her senior, a widower with a stone farmhouse and 90 acres of pasture inherited from his father, a quiet man whose first wife had died in childbirth 2 years before. He was, by all surviving accounts, a decent and hard-working farmer, a deacon of the Methodist chapel, a man who drank nothing stronger than cider and was known in the hamlet for the patience with which he broke his own horses to harness. Ruth accepted his proposal within 4 months of meeting him and moved her few trunks of books and linens into the Payne farmhouse in the spring of 1876. Those who knew her in Cobble Hollow described her in the careful phrases that farming communities reserved for women they couldn't quite place. She was too educated for a farmer's wife, they said. She read books late into the night by the kitchen lamp. The yellow light of that lamp could be seen from the road until 2 and 3 in the morning. A small, steady square against the enormous darkness of the surrounding hills. She kept a journal in a cedar box beside her bed. She had studied French at the Amsterdam Academy, and she corresponded, through letters traveling by mail coach and rail, with at least 3 women in Albany and 1 in New York City, whose names did not appear in any church register in the county. She was not unfriendly. She attended the chapel every Sunday morning, sitting in the 3rd pew from the front with her gloved hands, folded over a small black prayer book. She sang in a thin, surprisingly sweet soprano that carried over the deeper voices of the farmers around her. She brought preserves to the sick. She taught the small Cobble Hollow Sunday school class of 7 children. The children, by the account of one woman who had been among them and lived until 1937, adored her with a peculiar fierce loyalty that rural children reserve for any adult who treats them, as if they might one day be interesting. But she was not. The neighbors would later tell the coroner, quite one of them. There was a stillness in her that they did not know what to do with. A way she had of looking at a conversation from a little distance, as if listening for something underneath the words, that made the older women of the hamlet uneasy, without their being able to say why. And there was something else. Something only 2 of her neighbors would say out loud, and only after great hesitation, and only after the doctor from Albany had sat across from them at their own kitchen tables and asked the same quiet, patient questions 3 and 4 times over. In the last 6 months of her life, Ruth Payne had changed. She had grown thinner. Her cheekbones, always prominent, had become sharper. Dark hollows beneath her eyes had appeared that weren't there the previous summer. She had stopped wearing her wedding bonnet to church, replacing it with a plain black shawl drawn up over her head in the manner, she snorts, of a much older woman. She had been seen twice walking alone along the frozen brook at dusk in weather no sensible woman should have been walking in. Her arms wrapped tight around her body, her breath trailing white behind her in the cold air. On 3 separate occasions, the woman in the nearest house, a widow of 62, a brewer who had buried 2 husbands and raised 5 sons, and who did not, by her own description, miss much of what went on in the hamlet, had heard raised voices coming from the Payne farmhouse in the hours after midnight. Ruth's voice, the widow said, and Daniel's voice, and sometimes a 3rd voice, a man's voice, that the widow did not at first recognize. On each of those 3 occasions, the widow had stood at her own bedroom window in her nightgown and looked out across the snowy yard toward the Payne house. Each time, she had seen a single square of yellow light burning in the kitchen window. And each time, she had seen shadows moving across that light in a way she would later describe as resembling a slow and terrible hairy music dance. Each time, she had gone back to bed, pulled the quilt up around her shoulders, and pretended she had not heard anything at all. Because a widow of 62 in a hamlet of 7 houses does not interfere with what happens in another woman's kitchen in the middle of the night. Even when the sounds coming through the winter air are sounds she does not want to hear. She would regret that silence. She would later tell Dr. Tenney on the back porch of her own house on a July afternoon for every remaining day of her life. But regret, she would add in the same breath, was a poor kind of penance. The Lord would judge her for what she had not done the same, as he would judge the others for what they had. The morning of February 14th began for Daniel Payne at 4:15, when the cold woke him in the upstairs bedroom, and he discovered that his wife was not in the bed beside him. This, by itself, was not unusual. Ruth had been sleeping poorly for weeks and had taken recently to going downstairs in the small hours to sit by the kitchen stove and read. Daniel dressed in the dark, pulling on wool trousers over his long drawers, lacing the heavy boots he wore against the cold of the farmhouse floors. He came down the narrow staircase with a kerosene lantern held out in front of him. The house was entirely silent. The parlor, as he passed through it, was dark and still, the sheet-covered furniture looming like pale, crouching animals in the lantern light. The kitchen door at the far end of the parlor was closed. Daniel later swore, under 3 separate examinations by 3 separate officials, that when he opened that door, the room beyond was cold. Not merely cool, as a farmhouse kitchen often was in the hours before dawn, but bitterly cold. The cold of a room where no fire had burned for hours. The stove, a heavy cast, iron Union box stove with nickel-plated trim that Daniel had bought at the county fair in 1876, had gone out sometime in the night. The oil lamp on the table was extinguished, its wick black and curled. The window above the dry sink was clouded with a thin film of frost on the inside of the glass. Fern, like crystals, had grown across the lower panes in delicate, repeating patterns. And in the rocking chair beside the stove, where Ruth habitually sat in the mornings to drink her tea, there was a shape that his mind at first refused to accept as a shape. He said he stood in the doorway for a long time. He did not know how long, holding the lantern he had brought down, before he understood what he was looking at. His wife's head was leaning back against the chair's spindles, her eyes closed, her dark hair loose about her shoulders. Her expression in the flickering lantern light was entirely peaceful. Her left arm lay draped over the arm of the chair, the hand white and intact. A small silver ring on the 4th finger. The ring her father had given her on her 16th birthday. Her right stocking foot was extended forward, as if she had been in the act of rising, and everything else, everything between the base of her neck and her ankles, was gone. In its place, filling the seat of the rocking chair and spreading across the floorboards in a neat oval measuring, the coroner would later record, 31 inches by 19 inches, was a deposit of fine pale gray ash. The ash held at its center the unmistakable curve of a rib cage, the suggestion of a pelvis, the bent line of a femur. It was, Daniel said, as if his wife had been poured into the chair and the chair had kept the shape. He did not scream. He did not run. He stood, he said, for what felt like a very long time. Then he turned around, walked back through the front parlor, opened the front door, and walked the 3/4 of a mile through knee, deep snow to the widow brewer's house. In a voice she described as utterly calm, he asked if she would be so good as to come and look at something. The widow came. She was not a woman who required much persuading when a neighbor appeared at her door before dawn. She brought with her the hired man from the adjoining farm, a Palatine German named Jost Kieserlich, who had been awake in the barn milking his cows by lantern light. Jost brought his younger brother, Hendrik, who rode the sled track north to Breakabin to fetch the doctor. By 10 in the morning, 4 men and the widow were standing in the Payne kitchen, and none of them could speak. The kitchen by daylight was almost ordinary, a square room perhaps 14 feet on a side, with a plank floor worn smooth by 3 generations of Payne feet, a large pine table in the center, a dry sink against the east wall, a cupboard against the north wall containing the household's modest dishes, and the cast iron stove against the south wall. Its belly still cold, its door closed, the small brass draft lever at its base still open to the position Ruth must have set before she fell asleep. Above the stove, on a wooden rack, hung a row of copper pans polished to a dull shine. Beneath the window curtained, with unbleached muslin, stood the rocking chair. And in the rocking chair was what remained of Ruth Payne. Dr. Hendrik van Dusen, who had arrived from Breakabin just after 9, was a country physician of 54 years, a graduate of the Fairfield Medical College in central New York. He had delivered perhaps 400 babies, set perhaps 1,000 broken bones, and signed perhaps 600 death certificates in his career. He had seen, he believed, every way a human being could die in Schoharie County. He had not seen this. The stove, he would note in his report that afternoon in careful pencil, was stone cold to the touch. He laid his hand on top of it for a full minute to be certain. The floor around the oval of ash was unburned. The wooden arms of the rocking chair were scorched only where they would have contacted the body. Shallow scorching, not more than shoe music, 1/8 of an inch deep, as if someone had passed a hot iron lightly over the wood and then taken it away. The curtain at the window 2 feet from the chair was intact. A stack of kindling in the wood box beside the stove 3 feet from the chair was intact. A folded copy of the previous week's Schoharie Republican on the table 4 feet from the chair was intact. The doctor could read the headline about a proposed railroad extension to Combustion without turning the paper over. Ruth Payne's head, hair, face, and eyelashes were, the doctor wrote, in the careful hand of a man trying very hard not to commit to any conclusion he couldn't defend, perfectly preserved, as if she had fallen asleep in her chair and never woken up. There was no grimace of pain, no soot on her cheeks. The small silver cross she wore on a chain around her neck had fallen back into the neckline of her nightdress. What remained of it? The chain itself was intact and bright. The temperature required to reduce a human torso to calcined ash is not a matter of medical opinion, but of physics. A cremation furnace in 1879 operated at a minimum of 1400 degrees Fahrenheit and required 2 to 3 hours of sustained, directed heat to reduce a body to the condition in which Ruth Payne had been found. No fire of that intensity could have burned within 3 feet of unscorched wood. No fire of that duration could have left her face and hair untouched, and no fire known to medical science in the winter of 1879 could have confined itself so precisely to the soft tissue of a single human trunk. The doctor closed his notebook. The widow crossed herself in the Catholic manner, though she was a lifelong Methodist, and only afterward realized she had done it. Jost Kieserlich, who had fought at Gettysburg as a boy of 19 and had seen men burned in the aftermath, walked outside into the snow and was sick against the barn. When he came back inside, his face was gray, and he did not meet anyone's eye. That afternoon, a discussion took place among the men in the kitchen. Dr. Van Dusen wanted to send for the county sheriff. Jost Kieserlich, whose English was rough, but whose judgment was sound, agreed. Daniel Payne, sitting on a stool in the corner of the kitchen with his hands folded between his knees and his eyes fixed on the floor, said quietly that he did not want his wife's remains, what was left of her, to become a public spectacle. She had been a modest woman, he said. She would not have wanted to be stared at. In the same quiet voice, he said he believed the affliction that had taken her was a medical accident of a rare and terrible kind, and that the proper authority was not the sheriff, but the coroner, who could make his determination without curious neighbors. Dr. Van Dusen, who had watched Daniel closely through this speech, later wrote in a private letter to a colleague in Utica that he had never, in 30 years of country practice, seen a recently widowed man speak about his wife's remains with such precise and premeditated calm. If he had been a man of suspicious temperament, he might have taken that calm as a kind of evidence. But he was not a suspicious man. He was a tired country doctor in the hardest winter of his life, standing in a kitchen where something impossible had happened. He did what tired country doctors usually do in such circumstances. He accepted the husband's wishes. He sent Hendrik Kieserlich north again on the sled track, not for the sheriff, but for the coroner. He sat with Daniel, the widow, and Jost in the front parlor of the Payne farmhouse, with the kitchen door closed and a sheet draped over the rocking chair, until the coroner arrived late that evening. By then, the ash had begun in the dry, cold air of the kitchen to sift very slightly through the cracks between the floorboards. In the weeks that followed, the story of what had happened in the Payne kitchen spread through Schoharie County, the way cold spreads through a stone wall, slowly and from every direction at once. The Schoharie Republican ran a short notice on February 16th describing the death as a sudden misfortune of unexplained cause and expressing the community's condolences to Deacon Payne. The Combustion Index 3 days later described it as a probable apoplexy followed by accidental fire. The diagnosis Dr. Van Dusen had settled on after 2 sleepless nights, and which he himself did not believe. The Albany Argus, which had a correspondent in the county seat, and was willing to risk some sensationalism, printed a longer piece on February 22nd in which the word combustion appeared for the first time, carefully qualified by spontaneous. The piece was reprinted in edited form in 3 other regional papers over the following week. The story might have ended there, filed as a curiosity in the back pages of a county paper, if not for a physician from Albany named Dr. Cornelius Ten Eyck. He read the Argus piece over his breakfast coffee on the morning of February 23rd, and by that same evening was on the train west with a leather satchel full of instruments and an unshakable conviction that he had just been handed the case that would make his career. Yes, Dr. Ten Eyck was 44 years old, a professor of forensic medicine at the Albany Medical College, and a man whose professional ambition was matched only by his contempt for country doctors. He had published 7 papers on unusual modes of death, including a widely cited study of accidental poisonings among Troy factory workers, and a controversial monograph on infant asphyxiation in the urban poor. He had been waiting more than a decade for a specimen of what the medical literature then called preternatural human combustion. By the count of medical journals in 1879, some 30 documented cases had occurred in Europe and North America over the preceding century, almost all involving elderly women, heavy drinkers, and confined spaces. The case of the Countess Cornelia Bandy of Cesena in 1731 was the canonical reference in every textbook. Ruth Payne, at 26, a teetotaler, and in visibly good health only days before her death, did not fit the pattern. That, for Dr. Ten Eyck, was precisely the point. He arrived in Cobble Hollow on the morning of February 25th, 11 days after Ruth's death. He traveled from the Breakabin station by hired sleigh, wrapped in a bearskin robe, his satchel at his feet. He would later describe the approach to the hamlet as the strangest visual impression of his adult life. Snow had begun again during the night. The 7 houses of Cobble Hollow stood in a rough line along the frozen brook, dark roofs frosted white, chimneys smoking in thin gray plumes. Beyond them, the hills rose in long pale folds under a sky the color of slate. There was no sound except the creak of the sleigh runners and the horse's breath. No dog barked. No child shouted. The hamlet looked, he wrote, like an engraving from a German fairy tale, the kind in which something terrible has just happened inside one of the small, tidy houses, and no one has yet noticed. He was met at the door of the Payne farmhouse by Daniel, who had not, as far as anyone in the hamlet could tell, wept once in the intervening 11 days. Daniel was a tall man, 6 feet and some inches, with the long, slightly stooped frame of someone who had spent most of his adult life bending over plows and fence rails. His hair was sandy brown, thinning at the crown, combed severely back from a high forehead. His eyes were pale blue and widely set, and they had in them, Dr. Ten Eyck noted in his first diary entry about the case, the particular flat quality of eyes that had stopped expecting anything. Daniel shook the doctor's hand, took his coat, and led him through the parlor into the kitchen without speaking a word that was not strictly necessary. The rocking chair was still there against the west wall beneath the muslin, curtained window. The oval of ash had been swept up, placed in a sealed wooden box, roughly the size of a hat box, and kept, at the county coroner's instruction, in an unheated outbuilding behind the farmhouse. The scorched floorboards had been scrubbed with lye soap, but not replaced. The dark oval stain was still clearly visible beneath Daniel's boots. Dr. Ten Eyck set his satchel on the pine table and looked slowly around the kitchen. As he looked, he began to notice things the country doctor had missed, things that would, in the weeks to come, unravel the entire story. First, he noticed that the rocking chair was not in its natural position. It had been moved at some point before Ruth's death, perhaps 3 feet forward from the wall, into an open area of the kitchen, where there was no obvious reason to place it. The natural position, given the room's layout and the stove's habitual warmth, was against the wall where it now stood. But the faint wear pattern's she music on the floor showed it had been dragged forward and then returned. Second, he noticed the cupboard directly behind the chair, a tall pine cupboard with 2 upper and 2 lower doors. In its lower compartment were ceramic jugs that, when he opened the door and lifted one, were far lighter than they had any right to be. Daniel, asked what had been in them, said they had held coal oil for the lamps, but he had used up the supply during the long winter nights. Dr. Ten Eyck, who had counted the jugs and noted their combined capacity, did not say what he was thinking. Third, he noticed that the floor beneath the rocking chair, where the scorched oval stain was not at the kitchen center but offset, pushed away from the stove toward the window. The rag rug that had always lain under the rocking chair, according to the widow Brewer's later testimony, had disappeared sometime in the past months and had not been replaced. The small pedestal table that had always stood beside the chair, on which Ruth kept her tea and her book, was also missing. Daniel said music he had broken it up for kindling. In a winter as hard as that one, no one found this remarkable. Dr. Ten Eyck made a small careful note in his pocketbook and said nothing. Over the next 3 days, Dr. Tenake measured every surface in the kitchen, collected ash samples, interviewed Daniel, the widow brewer, Jost Kieserlich, and the Methodist chapel minister. He rode the sled track to Breakabin to examine the house where Ruth had grown up before her marriage. He spent an afternoon at the county seat's small records office, examining deed books, tax rolls, and the marriage register for the past 10 years. What he found, and what he wrote in the unpublished notebook that survived him, purchased 61 years later by a private collector in Cooperstown, has never appeared in any medical journal. The notebook runs 287 pages in Dr. Tenake's cramped, educated hand. It contains, among many other things, 3 observations he would eventually come to see as the 3 pillars of the case. The first observation, recorded on the second day of his stay, was that Ruth Payne had, in the final month of her life, purchased from the Breakabin General Store a total of 19 gallons of coal oil, a kerosene-based lamp fuel widely used in rural New York at the time. 19 gallons was far in excess of what the Payne household could have consumed for lighting. A normal farmhouse of the region, with 3 or 4 lamps in regular use, consumed perhaps 2 gallons a month in winter. The Payne household had only 2 lamps. Daniel pressed, could not account for the discrepancy. He said his wife had handled household purchases. He said he had not noticed. He said she had once mentioned a plan to varnish certain furniture in the spring, and he supposed the oil might have been intended for that. Dr. Tenake, in the margin of his notebook beside this entry, wrote a single word: implausible. The second observation, recorded on the 3rd day, was that Ruth had been observed by at least 2 separate witnesses wearing a corset of a new style recently advertised in Godey's Lady's Book. A garment whose stays were reinforced with a paste of calcium phosphate and animal fat. Dr. Tenake noted in careful Latin that this substance was highly susceptible to forming phosphorus compounds under prolonged body heat. The corset had been a gift, the widow brewer said. Ruth had shown it to her in October, laid out in its box with a ribbon around it, and had said, in a voice the widow remembered as unusually quiet, that it had come from a gentleman admirer of many years ago, who had sent it as a token of continued friendship. The widow had not asked who the gentleman was. She had seen Ruth wear the corset on several occasions afterward under a black wool dress that Ruth wore in the evenings, when she expected no visitors. The third observation, the one Dr. Tenake underlined twice, and then, in a different ink, and apparently at a much later date, circled 3 times, was this: Ruth Payne was, at the time of her death, in the early weeks of a pregnancy, and that pregnancy, according to dates Dr. Tenake carefully reconstructed from the widow's testimony, and from 3 letters he was eventually permitted to read, could not possibly have been her husband's child. If this story is already making you think twice about what people in small towns can hide, take a moment to like this video and let us know in the comments what you think happened in that kitchen. The records we are about to discuss were sealed for a reason. What Dr. Tenake learned next is why that seal was put in place, and why no one in Cobble Hollow or Albany ever spoke Ruth Payne's name again in any public setting for the remainder of the century. Dr. Tenake returned to Albany on February 28th and began, with the methodical patience of a man who had waited his whole career for exactly this, to assemble the rest of the story. He wrote letters to every address in the bundle of correspondence Daniel had grudgingly allowed him to examine. He interviewed, over the next 4 months, every person in the Mohawk Valley who had known Ruth Vosburgh before her marriage. He traveled twice to New York City to consult a Bellevue Hospital Medical College colleague on the chemistry of slow combustion. He spent a week in Albany County's Public Records Office. He sent a young assistant to copy from the dusty ledgers of a small printing shop on State Street every name recoverable from the account books of a certain quarterly publication printed there between 1870 and 1875. By the end of the summer of 1879, he had constructed a picture of Ruth Payne's life that, to anyone who had known only the quiet minister's daughter and dutiful farmer's wife of Cobble Hollow, was almost entirely unrecognizable. Before her marriage, Ruth Vosberg had been a member of a small, discreet society in Albany that met in the back rooms of that same State Street printing shop. The society described itself in the letters Dr. Teneyck was permitted to copy as a circle for the advancement of rational womanhood. It consisted of teachers, a few unmarried daughters of merchant families, 2 journalists, and 1 physician, a woman named Dr. Harriet D. Forrest, who had taken her medical degree in Geneva, Switzerland, some 20 years earlier and practiced, without a New York state license, in a consulting room above a milliner's shop on Broadway. The circle read Frances Wright and Margaret Fuller. They corresponded with a similar society in Boston and a smaller group in Rochester, associated with the memory of the suffragist movement. On a small hand press in the back room of the printing shop, they produced a quarterly pamphlet called The Reasoned Voice, of which no complete run survives in any public library, and in ways the surviving letters only hint at. They provided practical assistance to women of the city who found themselves in circumstances the law and churches of Albany would not officially acknowledge. What those forms of assistance were, Dr. Teneyck was careful not to set down in writing, even in his private notebook. But from the pattern of the letters from Dr. D. Forrest's particular professional credentials, and from the fact that 3 women named in the printing shop's account books had died in the intervening years, under circumstances officially recorded as female complaints, any reader of the notebook who understands the medical realities of the 1870s can draw his own conclusions. Ruth had left this society abruptly and without explanation in the autumn hay music of 1875, within weeks of meeting Daniel Payne at the Grange Hall music dance. Dr. Teneyck came to believe she had left because she had been seen at a meeting of the circle by a man who recognized her and threatened. In some manner, the surviving letters do not make entirely explicit to expose her. Who that man was, Dr. Teneyck could not at first determine, but one of the letters he obtained, written to Ruth by Dr. D. Forrest in November 1878, 3 months before Ruth's death, contained a single sentence that would eventually lead him to the answer. The sentence read, "I fear, dear Ruth, that the gentleman from Cobble Hollow has not forgotten you. And if he should come to the house on Broadway again, I cannot promise that I will be able to send him away a second time. The gentleman from Cobble Hollow was not Daniel Payne. Daniel Payne, at the time the letter was written, had never been to Albany in his life. The gentleman from Cobble Hollow was, as Dr. Teneyck confirmed through Hamusike, the laborious process of tracing property deeds and court records in the Schoharie County archive and checking them against the Albany Commercial Directory. A man named Augustus Voorhees, 48 years old, a textile merchant who owned a substantial summer house 3 miles from the Payne farm and spent June through September in the hamlet every year. Augustus Music of Voorhees was a man of considerable local reputation. He was the 3rd generation of a Dutch mercantile family that had been trading wool and cotton out of Albany since before the War of 1812. He was a member of the Albany Chamber of Commerce, a trustee of 2 banks, a communicant of the Second Reformed Church, and the owner of a 4-story brick house on Washington Avenue in the better part of the city. He was married to a woman of fragile health who rarely left the Washington Avenue house. He had 3 grown daughters, all married to respectable men. By every measurable standard of the 1870s, he was a man of unblemished public character. He was also, and this was the detail that made Dr. Ten Eyck set down his pen and sit for a long time staring out his study window on the evening of July 2, 1879, the uncle of Daniel Payne's first wife. He had introduced Daniel to his first wife 12 years earlier at a family picnic at his Cobble Hollow summer house. He had paid out of his own pocket for the carved marble headstone in the Cobble Hollow churchyard over that first wife's grave. He had, by the widow brewer's testimony when Dr. Ten Eyck pressed her a second time, plain as day, been seen entering the Payne farmhouse on at least 4 occasions during the summer and autumn of 1878. Always while Daniel was in the far pasture, always staying more than an hour, always leaving without speaking to anyone in the hamlet. And he was the man whose voice the widow eventually confessed to Dr. Ten Eyck in a whispered conversation on her back porch on the afternoon of July 15, 1879. She had recognized as the third voice raised in argument in the Payne farmhouse in the small hours of the night. 3 times in Ruth's final months. Dr. Ten Eyck was not by temperament a man who jumped to conclusions. He spent the autumn of 1879 assembling his findings into a careful scientific monograph, intending to present it before the Albany Academy of Medicine in January of the following year. The monograph argued with great care and abundant chemical diagrams that Ruth Payne had died of a rare but not unprecedented conjunction of physiological and environmental circumstances. It proposed that the calcium phosphate in her corset stays, warmed by prolonged body heat and the vapors of the 19 gallons of coal oil stored, he had discovered, in a cupboard directly behind her chair, had undergone a slow chemical transformation producing small quantities of white phosphorus. This phosphorus, ignited by either a stray ember from the stove or a momentary frictional spark from her own movement in the chair, had initiated slow combustion confined to the fatty tissues of her torso. A process similar to what undertakers then knew as the wick effect, and it proposed, in its final pages, and with considerable delicacy, that the unusually low body temperature of a woman in early pregnancy, combined with the unusually low ambient temperature of that February night, had somehow allowed the combustion to proceed without igniting the surrounding materials. It was, in its way, a remarkable piece of work. It was also, by modern forensic standards, almost entirely wrong, and Dr. Ten Eyck, in the last weeks of 1879, was beginning to suspect as much himself, because in the course of writing the monograph, he had returned to Cobble Hollow one final time on December 12, 1879, nearly 10 months after Ruth's death, and had interviewed for 2 hours in the widow brewer's back parlor a hired girl named Margaret Kieserlich, the 15-year-old niece of Jost Kieserlich, who had worked in the Payne kitchen 3 days a week throughout the autumn of 1878. Margaret was a slight, dark-haired girl who spoke English only haltingly. She had refused to speak to Dr. Van Dusen in February, and to Dr. Ten Eyck on his previous visits. She had changed her mind, she told the widow, because she had begun to have dreams. In the dreams, she said, she stood in the snow outside the Payne farmhouse, and Ruth Payne looked at her through the kitchen window. Ruth Payne was trying to tell her something, and Margaret could not hear. The dreams came every night. She had not slept through a single night since early summer. She was losing weight. Her mother, who did not know why, had begun to fear for her health. Margaret said she had decided to speak because she believed that if she did not, the dreams would kill her the way the hamlet's silence had killed Ruth Payne. What Margaret told him, in low Palatine German translated sentence by the widow, changed everything. Margit said that on the evening of February 13th, the night before Ruth was found dead. She had been sent to the Payne farmhouse at dusk to deliver a jar of preserves from her aunt. It had been snowing lightly. The last daylight was leaving the sky, and the path between the houses had been trackless. Margit had taken nearly half an hour to cover a distance that normally took 10 minutes. She had knocked at the front door. No one answered. She waited. She knocked again, more loudly, her knuckles stinging in the cold. She thought she heard through the heavy door a man's voice speaking sharply in the kitchen, but she could not be sure. She knocked again. No one came. She walked around the side of the house to the kitchen window, intending to leave the jar on the porch for Mrs. Payne to see in the morning. Through the kitchen window, the window above the dry sink, whose curtain that evening was drawn back rather than closed, Margit saw 3 people inside. Ruth Payne was sitting in the rocking chair. Daniel Payne was standing by the stove with his back to her, his broad shoulders hunched, his arms folded tight across his chest. In the posture, Margit said, of a man making himself stand still. And a third man. A man Margit had seen in the hamlet the previous summer at a social gathering at the summer house, whom she knew to be Augustus Voorhees, was standing directly in front of Ruth with something in his hands. Margit said she could not see clearly what the thing in his hands was, only that it was small and dark. Augustus Voorhees was leaning forward, speaking to Ruth in a voice too low to hear through the glass. Ruth was looking up at him, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her hands folded in her lap. Ruth's face, Margit said, wore an expression she had never seen on a grown woman's face before. An expression Margit, fumbling for the word in her 2 poor languages, described in the end as the look of a rabbit that has just understood the snare. The 3 figures held that tableau for several seconds. Then Augustus Voorhees reached out with one hand and took hold of Ruth's wrist. Ruth did not pull away. Daniel did not turn around. Then Augustus Voorhees spoke a single word. Margit thought in a harder, louder voice than before, though the glass muffled it. Ruth nodded once and closed her eyes. Margit ran back to her aunt's house without leaving the preserves. The jar was later found frozen solid in a snowdrift at the edge of the Payne property, where Margit had dropped it in her flight. She had not told anyone, not even her aunt, because Augustus Voorhees had once given her father a loan during a bad harvest year that her father had not yet repaid, and because a girl of 15 in Cobble Hollow in 1878 did not accuse a wealthy Albany merchant of anything. She was telling him now, the city doctor, because she could not sleep, and because the face she had seen through the kitchen window had become the face she saw behind her own eyelids every night, and because she believed, though she could not prove it and did not expect the doctor to believe her, that whatever had happened in that kitchen after she ran away had not been an accident, had not been a natural thing, and had not been anything the chemistry in the doctor's books would ever be able to explain. Just when we thought we understood what happened to Ruth Payne, the horror in Cobble Hollow begins to take a different shape entirely. If this story holds you in its grip, share this video with someone who loves the darker corners of American history. Hit that like button to support what we do here, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Then let us follow Dr. Tenike into the last act of this tragedy, because what he did with what Margit told him is perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire case, and the part no one was willing to put on the public record for more than a century. Dr. Tenike returned to Albany on the evening of December 14, 1879, carrying in his satchel the notes of his interview with Margit Kieserlich and a small muslin bag containing ash swept from the Payne kitchen floor 10 months before. He went not to his Elk Street house, where his wife waited with a late supper, but to his laboratory on the medical college's second floor. Working through the night by the light of 2 gas burners, he performed a series of chemical tests on the ash that he had not had the opportunity, or perhaps the motivation, to perform before. He tested for standard combustion residues, for the specific compounds expected from the wick effect theory. On a hunch he could afterward not explain, he tested for compounds associated with industrial and military accelerants. What he found by 3 in the morning of December 15th was this: the ash contained, in quantities not plausibly accounted for by the combustion of human tissue alone, measurable traces of potassium nitrate, sulfur, and fine charcoal, the 3 ingredients, in precise proportions, of black powder. Not the residue of black powder that had been fired as a firearm or charge, but the residue of black powder burned slowly in the open under controlled conditions, the way an apothecary or pyrotechnist might burn it to produce a specific chemical effect or quantity of directed heat. Dr. Ten Eyck sat at his laboratory bench for a long time that night. He put out the gas burners one after another and sat in the dark. The first gray light of morning found him still sitting there, his hands folded on the bench in front of him. He understood now what had been done to Ruth Payne. The heat required to reduce her torso to ash in the manner observed, in the time available, without igniting the surrounding room, could only have been produced by a deliberate and expert application of a slow, burning accelerant packed in and around her body, probably while she was unconscious or restrained, ignited so that the heat directed inward rather than outward. The wick effect his monograph was about to defend had been a red herring, almost certainly planted deliberately through the calcium phosphate corset and the 19 gallons of coal oil by someone who understood enough of contemporary medical theory to know what investigators would look for and accept as an explanation. The agent of combustion had been human, not natural. The work required a knowledge of chemistry that a country farmer of Daniel Payne's education could not have possessed, but a textile merchant who bought and sold dyestuffs, bleaching agents, and industrial accelerants across 3 states, a man like Augustus Voorhees, could have acquired without great difficulty. And he understood, finally, with a cold clarity that made him put down his pen and walk out into the snow on State Street at 4 in the morning, that what he had been investigating for the past 10 months was not a case of preternatural combustion at all. It was murder, executed with extraordinary care, disguised as a wonder of science so that no one would ever look for a murderer. He walked that morning from the medical college all the way home to his Elk Street house, nearly 2 miles through streets empty except for the milkman's wagon and a few lamplighters extinguishing the last gas lamps. He did not feel the cold. His mind worked through problems whose dimensions he was only beginning music to understand. If he made his finding public, what would happen to Ruth Payne's memory? Whose affair and pregnancy would become the central fact of the story, and whose killers might well escape on a technicality of evidence? If he went to the Schoharie County sheriff, whom would the sheriff actually investigate, in a county where Augustus Voorhees was a political donor of long standing and a personal friend of 2 sitting judges? If he wrote to the Albany district attorney, with the evidence, the ash, the notebook, Dr. D. Forrest's letters, would he be believed? A medical professor pursuing a private theory against a trustee of 2 banks. Behind all of these questions, pressing forward in the dim December morning light, was a question about himself. Dr. Cornelius Ten Eyck was 44. His career until this case had been solid, but not brilliant. He had wanted the Albany Medical College chair of forensic medicine for a decade, and had been passed over twice for younger men with better connections. He had 3 children in school whose fees strained his resources. He had an ailing mother in Schenectady, whose care he was quietly paying for. He was a man with a family, a reputation, and a mortgage, about to try to prosecute a man who could, with a single letter on the right stationery, destroy every one of those things without leaving visible fingerprints. Now, what Dr. Payne did next is the part of this story debated by the few scholars who have known enough about the case to debate anything for nearly a century and a half. He did not go to the Schoharie County sheriff. He did not publish his findings. He did not, as far as any record shows, speak of them to another living soul. Not to his wife, not to his medical college colleagues, not to the young assistant who had helped with the chemical tests and was afterwards sent away on an unexpected teaching assignment in Binghamton. He did, on the morning of December 17, 1879, write a letter to Augustus Voorhees at his Combustion Hollow residence. The letter has not survived, though Dr. Payne referred to it obliquely in a single line of his notebook dated December 17th. Letter sent to A.V. at the Hamlet. Certain matters laid before him in confidence. Response awaited. But the reply Augustus Voorhees wrote 3 days later, on December 20th, on heavy cream letterhead from the Voorhees Textile Company of Albany, was found folded carefully into the back, Schorsche music, torture of Dr. Payne's private notebook 61 years later, when the notebook was purchased at auction. The reply is 11 lines long. It thanks Dr. Payne for his discretion. It expresses confidence that the doctor understands the painful necessity of certain private arrangements when the reputations of families, the stability of communities, and the honor of the deceased herself are at stake. It promises, in language so courteous it takes a moment to understand what it is promising, that Dr. Payne's advancement within the state's medical profession will henceforth be assured. It mentions, as if in passing and almost as an afterthought, that a vacancy has recently opened on the Albany Medical College Board of Trustees, and that the board has been considering candidates of suitable distinction. The writer's own modest influence with 2 sitting trustees would, should the doctor find himself inclined to accept such a position, be placed entirely at the doctor's disposal. It closes with the warm regards and high esteem of a loyal friend who looks forward sincerely to their next meeting. Dr. Payne did not attend the Albany Academy of Medicine meeting in January of 1880. He did not deliver his monograph. He withdrew the paper from the program without explanation, citing in a brief note to the Academy secretary, unforeseen circumstances of a personal nature. He filed his notes, folded the letter into the back of his notebook, placed the notebook in a locked desk drawer, and over the following year was quietly appointed to the Albany Medical College Board of Trustees. He served on that board for 22 years. He published 4 more papers on unusual modes of death, none concerning Ruth Payne. He died of a stroke in the spring of 1901 at age 66. In his study armchair in Albany, with the evening newspaper folded across his knees. The notebook was found by his granddaughter, a schoolteacher named Elizabeth Payne, in the bottom of a cedar trunk in the attic of the Payne family home on Elk Street in the summer of 1940, while the house was being emptied after her own father's death. She read it through in a single afternoon, sitting on an overturned box in the dusty attic heat. She did not speak of it to her brothers. She sold it 3 months later to a private collector in Cooperstown for $75. The collector was, as it happens, a distant cousin of the Voorhees family of Albany. The notebook has been in his descendants' collection ever since. The records of the Ruth Payne case. The ones that should have been filed in the Schoharie County courthouse. That should have included the coroner's report, the physician's affidavits, Daniel Payne's deposition, and Jost Kieserlich's brief sworn statement given 2 days after the body was discovered, do not exist. They did exist once. Dr. Tennique cites them in his notebook with specific file numbers and dates. But in the summer of 1880, 6 months after Dr. Tennique received his appointment to the Medical College Board, the Schoharie County Courthouse suffered a small fire in its basement archive. The fire was contained to a single storage room. It was attributed in the county fire marshal's brief report to a defective kerosene lamp, left burning overnight in a corridor outside the archive. It destroyed, according to a brief notice in the Schoharie Republican on August 9, 1880, a quantity of miscellaneous papers of no great consequence. The papers included, among others, the entire coroner's file for February 1879, also the entire docket of property transactions involving the Voorhees family for 1877-1879, the marriage register for the Combustion, Hollow Methodist Chapel for the same period, and the complete run of local tax assessments on the Payne farm for the 5 years preceding Ruth's death. No other records in the archive were damaged. The defective kerosene lamp, extensively mentioned in the fire marshal's report, was never produced as evidence. The corridor where it had supposedly been left burning was never, according to the courthouse janitor, who read the marshal's report 3 years later and shook his head, a corridor where any lamp was ever kept. Daniel Payne sold the farm in the autumn of 1880 to a buyer who paid considerably above market rate and was represented in the transaction by a law firm with Washington Avenue, Albany offices. The firm had represented the Voorhees Textile Company in incorporation and taxation matters for the previous 15 years. Daniel moved to a small town in western Pennsylvania called Mercer, remarried 2 years later, fathered 3 children, and lived out his life as a respected elder of a Presbyterian congregation. He died in 1914 at age 70. His obituary, printed in the local paper, mentioned a first wife who had died tragically in a New York State house fire, and did not mention her name. His second wife, according to a granddaughter's recollection to a folklorist in 1968, said only that Daniel had been a good husband, but a silent one. In the last years of his life, he had taken to sitting up in their Mercer kitchen until 2 or 3 in the morning, alone, with a single lamp burning, looking at nothing. Once, the granddaughter said, her grandmother had come down in the night to find him weeping silently, his face in his hands. When she put her arm around his shoulders and asked what was wrong, he said only, "I did not turn around. I should have turned around." He never explained what he meant. He never said it again. Augustus Voorhees continued to summer in Cobble Hollow for another 15 years. He expanded the textile company, opened a second Boston office, and served 1 term in the New York State Senate, where his principal legislative achievement was a bill raising penalties for the corruption of public morals. In 1903, he endowed a chair in moral philosophy at a small Schoharie County college, whose founding documents stipulated that the chair's holder must deliver, once each year, a public lecture on the Christian virtues, music of temperance, chastity, and reserve. He died in 1909 at age 78 of complications following minor surgery. He is buried beneath a white marble monument in the Combustion Hollow churchyard, within sight of the smaller weathered stone marking Ruth Payne's grave. The inscription on his monument reads, "A merchant of integrity, a friend of virtue, a pillar of the community." The inscription on Ruth's stone, ordered and paid for by Daniel before he sold the farm and left for Pennsylvania, reads only, "Ruth Payne, wife 1852 to 1879, The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. The widow Brewer died in 1884 of pneumonia in her own bed at age 67. She had kept, until the end, a sealed envelope in the top drawer of her bureau, addressed to the Schoharie County District Attorney. Its contents were never disclosed to her family. When discovered after her death, it was opened by her eldest son and, without being read aloud, thrown into the kitchen stove. Margit Kieserlich married a farmer from the next county in 1883, raised 5 children, and lived until 1931. Her neighbors regarded her as unusually quiet. In the last year of her life, according to one of her granddaughters, she said, without any context at all, that there were things a person could see through a kitchen window that they should never have seen, and that they never afterward stopped seeing. Dr. Ten Eyck's notebook is today in the archive of a small private historical society in upstate New York that has chosen not to permit its reproduction or public display, on the grounds, according to a statement issued by the Society's Board of Trustees in 1987, that the document contains deeply sensitive material concerning identifiable families of the region whose descendants continue to live in the county. The ash of Ruth Payne, in its sealed wooden box, was buried in an unmarked corner of the Cobble Hollow churchyard in the summer of 1880, at the instruction of the then presiding Methodist chapel minister, whose name has not survived. The pages of the chapel register covering 1878-1881 were, like the coroner's file at the courthouse, destroyed at some point in the late 19th century. What was done to Ruth Payne on the night of February 13, 1879, was done by at least 2 men, in a locked kitchen, on the coldest night of a hard winter, in a hamlet at the end of a road the snow had closed. It was done to a young woman who had once, before her marriage, belonged to a circle of other young women who had believed the future would be different from the past, and who had chosen, when threatened, to leave that circle and accept a quiet life in a place where no one would ever come looking for her. It was done, almost certainly, because she was pregnant with a child that was not her husband's, and because the father, a man of 48 with a sick wife on Washington Avenue, 3 married daughters, and a reputation built over 3 generations of careful Dutch commerce, could not afford to have the fact known. It was done with chemistry borrowed from the textile trade, potassium nitrate, sulfur, and fine charcoal packed around the body of an unconscious woman in a rocking chair. It was disguised as a wonder of science, so that the only people who might investigate would be so dazzled by the prospect of a medical sensation that they would not think to look for a criminal. It was compounded by the quiet cooperation of a husband who had either been broken by his wife's affair or been promised something he wanted more than his wife, or both, and who stood in his own kitchen with his back turned, while another man put his hands on her, and it was concealed, finally, by the purchase of an ambitious physician's conscience, by a small convenient fire in a basement archive, and by the slow, numb, patient passage of 147 years of forgetting. This mystery shows us that the most terrible things in this country have not been done by monsters from beyond the edge of the world. They have been done by ordinary men in ordinary rooms, in ordinary towns, protected by the ordinary silences of the people around them. Hidden, finally, by history's willingness to let certain names, certain places, and certain women be quietly erased from the record. Science cannot explain what happened to Ruth Payne. Not because what happened was outside the laws of nature, but because the science of her time was used, deliberately and with great skill, to cover the tracks of what had been done to her. The men who killed her understood chemistry better than the doctor who tried to save her memory. The men who protected them understood the price of a conscience better than the men whose consciences were for sale. And the community around them understood, with the terrible practical wisdom of small places, that there are questions it is better for everyone concerned never to ask aloud. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has truly been revealed? Or are there still details, still names, still letters in trunks and journals in cedar boxes, waiting to be found in some attic in upstate New York by a granddaughter who will, this time, refuse to sell? Leave your comment below. Tell us what you think Daniel Payne was doing in that kitchen, whether you believe he knew, and whether you believe there is any forgiveness for a man who stands with his back turned while someone puts their hands on his wife. If this tale has held you, subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss what we uncover next. Share this video with someone who understands that the darkest history is not the history we were taught in school, but the history that someone, somewhere, once went to very great trouble to ensure we would never hear. See you in the next video.